till now we discussed that human respiratory system. Human respiratory system basically comprise of human respiratory passage and respiratory organ, that is lungs. So this is when we talk about human respiratory system, it starts from external nostrils, then we have nasal chamber, then we have epiglottis, larynx, trachea, bronchi, then we have lungs, and this is the diaphragm, pleural fluid, alveoli, and bronchioles. So these all are part of the human respiratory system. Okay. When we talk about respiratory passage, so this respiratory passage starts from nostrils and come towards the bronchioles, right? So this respiratory passage is basically meant for the carrying the air. The air which we inhaled will enter inside our body by the help of nostrils and will move towards the bronchioles. So this is part of the respiratory passage. So the respiratory passage will make the air favorable so that we can breathe it, right? So basically now moving forward, we will discuss about these respiratory passages, right? Respiratory passage, when we talk about, this is a flow chart. For better understanding, we have a flow chart, right? So this is flow chart showing structures involved in respiratory passage. When we talk about respiratory passage, here we have nasal chamber. Start with external nostrils. External nostrils are external nares, right? Air will enter with the help of external nostrils or external nares and will move towards the nasal chamber. Then it will move towards the internal nares. Then we have nasopharynx. Then we have glottis. Then we have trachea. Air will move towards trachea. From trachea, the air will enter the primary bronchi. Then it will move towards the secondary bronchi. Then tertiary bronchi, bronchioles, alveolar duct, atria, and we have here the alveoli. So this is the complete respiratory passage from external nostrils till bronchioles, right? We have the conducting part of respiratory system. Conducting part means it is the part which is meant for the purpose of conduction of air. And here we have for moving forward from bronchioles, we have alveolar ducts, atria, alveolar sac, and alveoli. So this is the part basically which is meant for the purpose of exchange of gases, or this is the respiratory part, right? So primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchioles, and bronchioles are also collectively known as bronchial tree. Bronchial tree is basically meant for the conduction of air only, and respiratory part or exchange part are also known as respiratory tree. Respiratory tree means here is basically the exchange of gases is taking place, right? So we have bronchial tree and respiratory tree as well. There are two terminologies, right? Primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and bronchioles. These four are collectively also known as bronchial tree. And whereas respiratory or exchange part is also known as respiratory tree, which is meant for the purpose for respiration, or where is the main site for the purpose of gaseous exchange, right? Now we'll discuss one by one each other, right? Now moving forward, we'll have a detailed look about what this conducting part is basically doing, right? Now, structures involved in respiratory passage. We discussed the flow, right? We have different we have different parts of the respiratory passage. So, what are these basically meant for? When we talk about external nostrils, we say that external nostrils are present is the opening, right? We have two nostrils, right? These nostrils or external nostrils, or we can also say external nares, right? External nostrils, we can also say it as external nares or external nares. These basically are meant for the intake of air. Okay, so it will intake air, or we can say intake of oxygen. So we have two nostrils, right? These two nostrils will basically take the air from the outside environment, right? When we talk about the location of the external nostrils, it is present above the upper lip, right? When we talk about the location, it is present above the upper lips, right? See yourself in a mirror, then you will get better answer, right? We have nostrils which are present just above our upper lip, right? So this is the location of the nostrils, right? So these 2 points are important about the external nostrils. That is, external nostrils are basically meant for the intake of oxygen, that or intake of air, or we have its opening is present just above the upper lips, that is, external nostrils are present above the upper lips, and it is the first part of respiratory passage. It is the first part of passage. Which passage? Respiratory passage. It is the first part, right? We have discussed earlier in the flow of the respiratory structures. So it is mainly the main part which is meant for the intake of air, that is the oxygen, right? Because oxygen is required. Now we have nasal chambers. Nasal chamber, this is the nasal chamber, right? In between we have nasal septum. So nasal chamber or nasal cavity basically has nasal septum which divides into two parts, and these nasal chamber basically performs various functions which we'll discuss, right? Nasal chamber, we can say, when we discuss about the points of the nasal chamber, we can say that nasal chamber has nasal septum, right? Nasal septum, which is present in between the middle, it divides the nasal chamber into two halves, right? So air which enters by the external nostrils is carried towards the nasal chamber. Inside the nasal chamber there is nasal septum, right? And this nasal septum helps in bifurcating the nasal cavity or nasal chambers, right? Nasal septum will divide it into two halves, and these nasal chamber is line means it has the lining of, right? It has lining of ciliated epithelium. And cuboidal epithelium. Cuboidal epithelium, right? In lower classes, you must have heard that the human body is basically made by 4 type of animal tissues, right? These animal tissues basically forms the complete body of a human, and these are basically the epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and the nervous tissue. So epithelium is a type of animal tissue, and it also has further classification, right, which we'll discuss in various chapters. But you must remember that the nasal chamber has the lining of ciliated epithelium and cuboidal epithelium, right? Because this has a purpose, right? So the nasal cavity or the nasal chamber is internally lined by these two type of epithelium, right? Now we'll talk about the functions of the nasal chambers, right? Air which we have taken from outside will have various dust particles, right? But our body cannot use it, right? So the purpose or the function of the nasal chamber is to make the air which we have inhaled is favorable so that it can be utilized by our body. So the function of nasal chambers, and these are basically performed by the epithelium, right? We also have one more epithelium here, that is olfactory epithelium. Which epithelium? Olfactory epithelium. And these three are basically meant for performing different functions, right? These all three epithelium which is present in the lining of the nasal chamber basically perform important functions, right? So clear till now that is nasal chamber. Nasal chamber is divided by the nasal septum, and it is lined by these three type of epithelium, which basically perform the various functioning. Now we'll discuss one by one what are the functioning which is performed by these nasal chamber. When we go to a polluted area, right, we generally start sneezing, right, or we have dust in the air. So these dust, if it must be containing any pollutant or germ, it may enter inside our body and it may affect us, right? So in order to provide protection or to entrap the dust particles, air must be having dust particles. So in order to entrap the dust particles, we have ciliated epithelium. So ciliated epithelium will entrap the dust particles and will make the air clean, right? The air outside is polluted and it must have the dust particles. So the epithelium, which is the ciliated epithelium, basically cleans the air, right? So first function of nasal chamber is cleaning of air, right? Cleaning of air, right? So the air which we have inhaled or inspired, or it is basically cleaned so that it can be used by our body. Second function which is performed by the nasal chamber is basically humidification. Humidification of air, right? It makes the air moist and humidified so that it can be used by our body. Third is basically it used to maintain the temperature, right? Human body temperature is maintained, right? We have almost about 37 degree of temperature, but this temperature, but outside temperature changes, right? In winters the temperature goes down and in summers the temperature is extreme high, so our body cannot inhale the air at that appropriate temperature. So these three functions, basically cleaning of air, humidification of air and maintaining of the temperature, is basically done by the nasal chambers epithelium. Humidification or air is done moist with the help of the second epithelium which we talked about is cuboidal epithelium. Cuboidal epithelium basically secrete mucus. It secretes mucus. Mucus is a liquid which helps in making the air moist or humidified, and this mucus is basically released by the goblet cells. So we can say that cuboidal epithelium basically forms the goblet cells, and these goblet cells will release the mucus, and this mucus will make the air humidify so that we can breathe in, right? The third function is maintaining temperature. It is also done by the nasal chamber, right? Next, we talked about third epithelium, that is olfactory epithelium, right? When there is something delicious food, right, we can recognize it with the help of our smell, right? How we can recognize it? We have olfactory epithelium, right? Olfactory epithelium present inside our nose help in detection of the chemicals, right? So whether the food is delicious or it is not, we can smell it, right? It is basically with the help of the nasal epithelium, right? So this nasal epithelium basically help in sense of smell or sense of olfaction. So that's why it is termed the olfactory epithelium, which we have discussed, right? Now moving forward, the internal layers. I hope these three functions are clear. Now moving towards the internal layers. External layers or nostrils take the air. It deliver to the nasal passage or nasal chamber or nasal cavity. Now the air will move from the nasal cavity towards the internal layers, and from the internal layers it will move towards the other part of the respiratory passage, that is the pharynx, right? So internal layers, when we talk about internal layers, it is the posterior opening, right? Anterior opening is the external layers. So it is the posterior opening of nasal chamber, right? It is posterior opening of nasal chamber, and it will open to the next part of respiratory passage, that is the pharynx. Opens towards the pharynx. Clear? So it will open further towards the pharynx. That is the fourth part of the respiratory passage. Clear? Now moving forward, we have nasopharynx. It is the fourth part of the respiratory passage. When we talk about pharynx, pharynx is basically divided into three parts, right? Pharynx, when we talk about, is divided into three parts, right? Pharynx has three parts. These are nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Pharynx basically has three parts. Nasopharynx, which is related with the respiration. Then we have oropharynx. Then we have laryngopharynx. Laryngopharynx. So the pharynx is divided into three parts, that is nasopharynx, which is related with the respiratory passage. Oropharynx, it is related with the digestive system, that is the food pipe. And laryngopharynx, which is basically meant for the purpose of sound production, right? The air which is entered by the internal layers, that is the posterior opening, will enter towards the nasopharynx part of the respiratory passage. Now, from nasopharynx, it will move towards the larynx. It will move towards the larynx. That is, from nasopharynx, the air will move towards the laryngopharynx part, and then it will move towards the trachea. Okay. When we talk about larynx, larynx is basically the sound box or voice box, right? So when we speak something, the vibrations are produced, and these vibrations then here, right? The basically sound production is done by the larynx. And larynx is also covered by various type of cartilages, right? When we talk about larynx, larynx is termed as the sound box or voice box, right? Because larynx has vocal cords which are basically meant for the purpose for sound production. In larynx also there are two type of vocal cords. One is true vocal cord and the other is false vocal cord. The vocal cord which is basically meant for sound production is the true vocal cords, right? So when in questions when it is asked that the larynx, which vocal cords are basically meant for the sound production, then it is true vocal cords. True vocal cords, right? Larynx, when we talk about, is covered by a flap-like structure, right? This flap-like structure is termed as the glottis, right? Larynx will open into trachea. This is trachea, long tube-like structure, right? It is covered by a help of cartilages, right? So larynx, which is meant for sound production, will open into the trachea, and the opening is termed as the glottis, right? Trachea, when we talk about trachea, basically is known as windpipe. You must have heard in your junior classes that trachea is windpipe, right? Windpipe, right? So this trachea is basically a long tube-like structure, right? It is 10 to 20 centimeter long tube-like structure, and this tube-like structure basically covered by these rings. These rings are basically meant to prevent the collapsing, right? So there are 16 to 18 incomplete cartilaginous rings. Incomplete cartilaginous rings, right? And these rings help in preventing the collapsible of the trachea, right? So air which is entered by the nasal internal nares towards the nasopharynx will open into the larynx, because larynx is a sound box or voice box, and then from the larynx it will open into the trachea. So trachea or windpipe. When we talk about pharynx we say that it is a common passage for food pipe and windpipe, right? So there is a cartilage named epiglottis, which is a flap-like cartilage, elastic cartilage, which covers the larynx during sound production, right? That's why when we eat something, right, then it is always said that do not speak and eat simultaneously, right? Because if the food may enter into the windpipe, but our body has epiglottis which covers the windpipe during swallowing of food, right? So this epiglottis covers the opening and thus doesn't allow the food to enter into the windpipe, right? So this is the air will enter from larynx towards the trachea. Now trachea, these are the main points regarding the trachea, right? This trachea basically a long tube like structure, and it is part of the respiratory passage. It is meant for the conduction of air. It is 10 to 20 centimeter long tube, and it is covered by incomplete cartilaginous ring, and these cartilaginous ring prevent collapse. These prevent the collapse so that the air which is inhaled doesn't get collapsed, and it maintain the proper space, right? So that the air can enters inside our trachea. So till now we have discussed about the trachea. Now trachea will open into the bronchi. So the trachea divides. Trachea is a long tube-like structure. As we discussed earlier, it is 6 to 20 centimeter tall in length. So the trachea bifurcates at the level of trachea bifurcates at the level of fifth fifth thoracic vertebra. Fifth thoracic vertebra into the bronchi, right? When we talk about the bronchi, so this is the trachea. Here you can see that the trachea is bifurcating here, right? This bifurcation is occurring at the site of fifth thoracic vertebra. As we know that we have vertebral columns at the back side, so at the level of fifth thoracic vertebra, that is fifth number of thoracic vertebra, it will divide into primary and secondary bronchi. The bronchi comprises of primary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole, tertiary bronchiole, and it will terminate into the respiratory bronchiole. Respiratory bronchiole. Right? Primary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole, tertiary bronchiole will comprises the bronchiole tree. So bronchiole tree will start from the primary bronchi to tertiary bronchi. Right? As we talked about that the trachea has, you can see these incomplete cartilaginous rings. So primary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole and tertiary bronchiole are also enclosed by these C-shaped cartilaginous rings which will prevent the collapsing. And this bronchiole tree is generally the conducting part. It will only conduct the gases. Here is no efficient gaseous exchange takes place. Gaseous exchange, that is the main function of respiratory passage, will start after the respiratory bronchiole, right? So this is all about the bronchiole. So it bifurcates here. It will form primary bronchi, then it will form the secondary bronchi, then it further bifurcates to form tertiary bronchiole, and this tertiary bronchiole will open up into the small respiratory bronchiole, right? So moving forward, we'll discuss about the lungs, right? When we talk about the lungs, you can see here in the diagram as well, lungs are two in number. Two in number, or we can say that these are one pair, right? One pair. As you can see, the color of the lungs is pinkish in color, right? So we can say that lungs are generally pink in color, right? So lungs are basically pink in color during the time of birth, right? And lungs generally are the main site of gaseous exchange, right? So when we talk about it, lungs, right? So you lungs, when we talk about, there are few of the points regarding the lungs, right? So it is visible. When we talk about lungs, so lungs is present in thoracic cavity, thoracic cavity or chest cavity, chest cavity. As you know, our body is divided into various segments, that is head, neck, thorax, and abdomen. So, in the thoracic cavity, these lungs are present, or thoracic cavity is also known as chest cavity. When we talk about lungs, lungs are well protected. Well protected. Well protected means it is well protected inside our thoracic cavity. As you can see, we talked about that it dorsally it has vertebral column, right? So when we talk about the protection, there we have dorsally it has vertebral column, right? Dorsally the lungs is covered by vertebral column or backbone. Ventrally we have the sternum, ventrally enclosed by sternum. Sternum is a bone. It is flat bone. It is present at ventral part. So dorsally we have the vertebral column. Ventrally we have the sternum. Now when we talk about laterally enclosed by ribs. We have ribs, right? We have ribs which enclose the thoracic cavity, right? So the lungs are well protected. Dorsally we have the vertebral column, ventrally we have the sternum, and laterally we have the ribs which protects our lungs, right? When we talk about the lungs, so this is about it. Now moving forward, we'll discuss that is the lungs in detail, right? So as you can see in this diagram about the lungs. So we'll start first with lungs membrane, right? So when we talk about the lung is completely covered by membranes, right? And these membrane are two in number, and these membrane we can say are the pleural membranes, right? These are the pleural membranes. So we can say the lungs is well protected as it is present in thoracic cavity. Secondly, it have a membrane which encloses the lungs, right? So there are two in number. So this is outer membrane, and we can draw with another color, that is two membranes, right? So the purple color will be the outer pleural membrane, and this slightly light color will be inner pleural membrane, right? So lung also it is well protected in thoracic cavity. It also has outer two coverings, and these coverings are formed by the pleural membranes, right? Now when we talk about the membranes, so these membranes are outer pleural and inner membrane. Outer pleural membrane, outer pleural membrane and inner pleural membrane. Outer pleural membrane is also known as parietal membrane, and inner pleural membrane is also known as inner visceral pleural membrane. So there is space in between the two membranes, right? You can, if you see the diagram, we had outer pleural membrane and we had inner pleural membrane, right? So in between there is some space, right? So this space is termed the pleural cavity. This space is basically the pleural cavity, and it is filled with a fluid, that is pleural fluid, right? So this is all about the membrane. There are two in number, right? Two in number, that is outer pleural membrane and inner pleural membrane. Outer pleural membrane is also known as parietal membrane, and the inner pleural membrane is also known as visceral pleural membrane. And outer pleural membrane is in direct contact with the thoracic cavity. As we are saying that lungs are present in thoracic cavity, so outer pleural membrane is in contact with thoracic cavity. So you can note this point as out of the pleural membrane, which membrane is in contact with the thoracic cavity. So we can say that outer pleural membrane is in contact with thoracic cavity, right? Right. So outer pleural membrane is in contact with the thoracic cavity. When we talk about inner pleural membrane is in direct contact with the lungs, right? We are saying we had two membranes, right? So outer is in contact with the thoracic cavity, and inner pleural membrane is in contact with is in contact with lungs, right? So these are 2 points which are asked in examination, right? That is out of the two pleural membranes which is in contact with the thoracic cavity, and the another one which is in contact with the lungs, right? So this is all about the membranes, that is membrane which cover the lungs. Now we'll talk about function of the pleural fluid. As we have seen that there is a space between the pleural membranes, and this space is termed the pleural cavity, and this pleural cavity is filled with the fluid, that is pleural fluid, right? This pleural fluid helps in the protection of the lungs, right? It will protect the lungs and it will act as shock absorber, and it will also help in the reduction of friction, right? It will reduce the friction and help in protection, right, from shock absorber. So we can say that the pleural function of the pleural membrane is basically protection and act as shock absorber and act as shock absorber, right? And also reduce the friction. When one pleural membrane slides over the other, so it will prevent the friction at that time, right? And help in efficient functioning of the lungs. So this is all about the function of the pleural fluid, right? Which is present in the pleural cavity. Present in pleural cavity, and pleural cavity is the space between the outer and inner membrane, right? Cavity between pleural membranes, right? Clear till now? Now we'll discuss about the internal structure of the lungs, right? So in the previous slide, you have seen that lungs, there are two in number, right? Two in number, lungs are two in number, and their color was pink in color, right? So now we'll discuss some of the points with the help of diagram, and then we'll note it down for the better understanding, right? So we'll start with the internal structure of the lungs, right? So when we talk about internal structure of the lungs, we here have, you can see in this diagram, we have two lungs, that is right lung and left lung. As you can see here that in left lung there is a cardiac notch, right? This cardiac notch is basically is the site where heart is attached, right? So this is the cardiac notch. This is the site where our heart will get situated. So this is our left lung. You can see this left lung is left lung has two lobes, right? Has two lobes. You can see here that there is a present of this line. You can see this is oblique fissure. Oblique fissure basically divides the lung into two lobes. So left lung therefore has two lobes, right? And it also has a space that is called cardiac notch. It is basically site where the heart resides, right? When we talk about the right lung, here you can see in right lung there are three lobes. This is superior lobe, here is the middle lobe, and this one is the inferior lobe, right? And here are two fissures. Here is only one fissure, that is oblique fissure. Here in the right lung, there are two fissures, that is oblique fissure and the horizontal fissure, right? Horizontal fissure is present between superior lobe and the middle lobe, and the oblique fissure is present between the middle lobe and the inferior lobe. So we can say that right lung has three lobes and two fissures, whereas left lung has two lobes and one fissure. So we can say that here oblique fissure is the common point in between the two lungs, and there are superior lobe and inferior lobe. But in right lung, there we have three lobes, that is medial lobe as well, right? So this is the about the lungs, right? Now moving forward, about the lungs, we'll discuss some of the few points here. The lung position. When we talk about the position, of lungs, we have said that it is well protected, right? It is well protected in the thoracic cavity, and it is two in number, right? When we talk about the lungs, they are two in number. Lungs, two in number, or we can say one, right? We have seen that it is pinkish in color during birth, right? Pink in color, pink in color at birth. But later on, as we are exposed to various number of pollutants and dirts, so the color of the lungs changes to gray color, dark gray, right? And those who are smokers, the color of lungs changes from more dark, right? The color will change to more dark. So later on, dark gray color is visible, right? During the time of birth, the lungs are pinkish in color, and later on, as we grow, the color of the lung changes from pink to dark green color, right? Now, when we talk about lungs, the lungs basically is the site where our main gaseous exchange takes place, right? Main gaseous exchange part, right? It is the site where exchange takes place. So, what is present in the lungs which help in the gaseous exchange? So, we talked earlier about bronchial tree, right? Now we'll discuss about the respiratory tree. Respiratory tree is basically present inside lung only, right? Respiratory tree comprises of respiratory bronchiole, that is terminal bronchiole open into the respiratory bronchiole. We discussed earlier in respiratory passage. It will form the alveolar duct. Alveolar ducts will open up into, you can write here, atria, and this atria will terminate into the alveolar sac and then alveoli, right? So alveoli is the main site where gaseous exchange will take place, right? So respiratory tree comprises of respiratory bronchiole, alveolar duct, then atria, alveolar sac, and alveoli. And alveoli is the main site where gaseous exchange will take place, right? So this respiratory tree is basically the site where gaseous exchange will start to take place. And these respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, atria, alveolar sac are not lined by any incomplete cartilaginous ring, right? So respiratory tree, from here begins the gaseous exchange. Till now we are talking about gaseous exchange. So here is the main site where gaseous exchange will start, right? Now we'll discuss about some of the few questions, right? So when we moving forward toward the questions, so the first question is, how many of the following structures are common in the left and right lungs of humans? As we discussed earlier, we talked that there are two in number, that is right and left lung, and the left lung has two lobes and the right lung has three lobes. So we can say that presence of lobe is one of the character, right? Out of the four options, first is horizontal fissure, second is oblique fissure, C is cardiac notch, third and the fourth is the presence of lobes. When we talk about horizontal fissure, it was only present in the right lobe, right? It is not present in the left lobe. So it cannot be the common character. So it will, this option will be incorrect, right? Now, when we talk about oblique fissure, we have seen that in left lung there were two lobes, and this lobes was bifurcated with the help of oblique fissure. Whereas in right lung also there were three lobes, but there were presence of two fissures, that is oblique fissure and the horizontal fissure. So the oblique fissure can be one of the character. So this will be the correct point. Now moving towards the third option, that is the cardiac notch. Cardiac notch was only present in the left lung, right? So it is not common between the two lobes. And the next option is presence of lobes. Yes, there are presence of lobes, right? Numbering is not mentioned, so therefore it will be the correct. So the correct option is option A is 1, option B is 2, C is 3, and D is 4. So we can see that out of the 4 statements, only 2 statements are going right. So the correct option will be option number B, that is 2, right? So the answer will be option number 2 for the given question, right? It's clear. Now moving forward, we have next question.